We are on part 2 of a summer series that we're doing called At the Movies, where what I've been doing is I've been going through some of my favorite movies, some movies that really kind of touch my heart or whatever, and we're talking about the themes in those films and how they might relate perhaps to God or to our journey of faith or to the church or whatever, because I think it's important that we learn how to take things that are normal for everybody and make them conversations about our faith. And so I love doing this stuff because this is really who I am. I love movies, always have. I was a child actor and have had this a part of my life, not just watching, but in them. I did a film with CBC when I was little. I've been on TV. I've done tons and tons and tons of theater. Just love it to pieces. And so I have a lot of fun with movies. But I'm always, no matter what movie I'm watching, I'm always looking for where Jesus is in a moment, where it is that he might be speaking, or where there might be a bridge that we can speak from, given a popular movie. Now, there are obvious exceptions, but I don't watch those movies, so. So, I'm guessing that by now, I have talked about this sort of stuff enough that most of you, if not all of you, know that I am a pretty big fan of science fiction fantasy as a genre. Not only have I watched lots of movies. I'm a big Star Wars guy. But when I was young, I did a lot of science fiction reading. I read all the old greats and some of the ones from the 70s and 80s as well. And one of my favorite authors, especially when I was younger, was a fellow by the name of Alan Dean Foster. And it happened almost by accident because someone put one of his books in my hand. It was a book called Splinter of the Mind's Eye. Now, it's something he wrote, but as you can probably tell from the cover, it actually takes place in the Star Wars universe. It has nothing to do with the movies, and no matter how you read it, it doesn't actually fit with the storyline that you know from the movies. But he wrote an independent book called Splinter of the Mind's Eye, and me being a Star Wars fan, I ate it right up. I loved it. I thought it was so good. And because I liked this book so much, I started reading other books of his. I read For Love of Mother Not from the Pip and Flinks series. Otherworldly, lots of creatures, kind of weird stuff, but I had a lot of fun with it. I read Nor Crystal Tears. I read Ice Rigger. I read the sequel, Mission to Mulligan. I loved these books. I loved the way he wrote and just the huge imagination this guy had to come up with these incredible, fantastic stories. And I really got into them. And so I was reading all this stuff, but then one day, I ran out of stuff to read, and so I went looking around the house for another book because I just wanted to read something. And I went and I found my dad had a bookcase, kind of tucked away sort of, and I went and I was looking at his bookcase, and he had a book from Alan Dean Foster on it that I thought, hey, that's awesome. I'd never heard of it, didn't know anything about it, and I took it out and I looked at the cover, and it was actually rather plain. It was just kind of an egg floating in space, and I thought, man, that's really cool. They're always really weird, and so I took it upstairs and started reading the book. And immediately two things happened. One, I couldn't put the book down. One of the very best books I've ever read. I mean, the writing was so good. And two, I was more scared than I have ever been in my life. I mean, I was absolutely terrified. So, yeah, many of you have seen the movie. I don't know that any of you have read the book. He wrote it long before the film, and yeah, wow. I had no idea. I mean, I was used to the imagery of science fiction and fantasy novels. I was used to what their covers looked like, and they were usually strange, and sometimes they were a little unsettling, but, they didn't always have a whole lot to do with the story. And so I see an egg floating in space, and I really didn't, honestly, I didn't read the in space, no one can hear you scream bit, but I just seen this thing, and I thought, cool, aliens, right? And so I picked it up, and I took it, and I read it, and wow. This is the day that I learned the hard way to never judge a book by its cover. Yeah? Yeah. But wait, there's more. You see, it doesn't, this old saying that we have about not judging a book by its cover doesn't just apply to novels, it also applies to movies. Take this movie, for example. This came out some time ago, and when I first saw the trailer for this, I basically ignored it for a couple of reasons. One of them, the main actor is Mark Wahlberg, as you can probably see if you know who that guy is. Oh, his name's there. Okay, so the main actor is Mark Wahlberg. And the few movies that he made just before this were awful. I mean, his acting was kind of plastic. The story was, weak doesn't even cover it. They were just bad. And so when this came out and I saw the trailer and I saw he was in it, I just kind of rolled my eyes. But I want you to see the trailer so you know where I'm starting off, because this is our starting off point. We're talking about this movie today. So I'm going to show you just the trailer rather than scenes from the movie. And I don't know, maybe you'll have the same impression I did. Okay, so the funny thing, the more I watch it, the more I go, actually the trailer's not that bad. But when I first watched it, I had all this stuff in my head about how bad his previous, 3 movies or so before this were, and I didn't give it a chance. I did not care at all. This movie trailer was released at the beginning of March 2016. I think the movie came out that summer, and I didn't watch it until this year when we were in lockdown. I think just after Christmas maybe. Tracy and I were looking for something to watch. We were losing our minds just a little bit, and we didn't know what to do. And this was on. It was new on Netflix, and I thought, oh, whatever. We were tired and wanted to watch something, and we watched it. I have not been so shocked by a movie in all the time I can remember. I watched it and I was blown away, no pun intended, honestly. Boy, was I ever wrong. And this really was a case of sort of judging the book by its cover, or its lead actor. I'm not sure how that was, but man, I felt like, oh man, this has been out for years. I couldn't see it and I didn't. Now, honestly, I'm making a bit of a bigger deal about it right now because it kind of fits with what I'm talking about today. But the truth is I actually was in the moment. I was really kind of put off. I was like, man, this has been sitting here all this time, because it's an amazing movie. And Jamie and I watched it again, just a couple of days ago, just to refresh my brain as I was writing the message. And I got to tell you, even watching it a second time, I was on the edge of my seat, heart pounding, just, oh my goodness, what a great movie, so well written. I am guilty of judging the book by its cover, with books, with movies, and with other things too. Have you ever done that? Have you ever been in a place where you sort of judged, maybe it was literally a book or a movie or anything else? Have you ever judged a book by its cover? Or better yet, maybe a better question to ask is, have you ever judged another person by what you saw with your eyes? Because I have. I've done that. I've probably done it many times in my life. And it struck me how awful I have been in doing that all of my life until I met Christ. And then as I began to really unpack, man, I've done it since I've been a Christian too, I'm sure. So I want to talk a little bit about that this morning. Did you know that the whole judging a book by its cover, that saying that we have, it's actually a fairly modern one, but it's actually a biblical concept. Did you know that? See, there's this story in the Old Testament about the day that God sent his prophet Samuel to anoint the new king. It's a pretty popular story. In fact, it's the first time we really start hearing about David, who became King David. And David and Goliath, all the same guy, for those who don't know. We start hearing about him in this story. David wasn't born a king. He wasn't born into a royal family. He was born into a shepherding family, and he was the youngest of all of his brothers. David was a poet. David was a musician. He was handsome, and he was well liked, but he wasn't a king. Now, during this time when all this was going on, the people of Israel had wanted a king. They wanted a human king so that they could be like all the other nations of the earth. But up until this time, God had been their king. God had led the people. They had followed him not only as their Savior, as their Lord, as their God. They followed him as their king. But now The people wanted to be like the other nations. All the other nations had human kings. They wanted a person on the throne. And God warned them what a king would do to them, but they refused to listen, and they insisted that they be given a king to lead them. And so it was that a man named Saul was made king over Israel. And let me tell you, he was a leader, all right. At least he was pretty bossy. He was greatly admired by the people. He was of great stature as well. I mean, he was very, very tall. The Bible says that he was head and shoulders above all the other men in Israel. I mean, you can picture that? His head and his shoulders are like his shoulders are this high. His head's like, he was a big dude. Huge, a warrior. And just as God said he would, Saul went the wrong way. Saul harmed the people. Saul started thinking only about Saul and started making everything about him. He became interested in only himself, and eventually God rejected him as king. Now, at the same time, there was a prophet named Samuel. And Samuel had been around for a long time. He had watched Saul become king and watched Saul do all the things that he had done. And in fact, it was Samuel that went to Saul to try and get his head screwed on right, but Saul wasn't having it. And so God called upon Samuel at some point to anoint another king. Enough of this Saul guy, we want somebody else. And he told Samuel to go see a man named Jesse in Bethlehem, and there he would find the one that was to be anointed as king. And so he does. Samuel goes. He goes and he finds Jesse, and Jesse's sons are brought before Samuel, one after the other, so that he can examine them. And the eldest, Eliab, he enters, and the scriptures tell us that when he walks into the room, Samuel sees him, and he thinks to himself, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. Right away, all he's done is seen him. The guy just walks in, he says, surely the Lord's anointed one stands here before the Lord. But what happens next is what makes this story so cool. You see, no sooner had this thought passed through his head than the Lord says, now this is in 1 Samuel chapter 16, in verse 7, it says this, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So he was saying, you're looking at the wrong things. You're looking at the wrong stuff. I want the right kind of king. I think this kind of thing happens to people sometimes without us even realizing it. Do you know what I mean? We find ourselves making judgments from our own perspective, our own broken human perspective, only to discover that we're looking for the wrong things, or if we discover that at all. Now, I'm sure that most of you have heard or read Isaiah 55:8, where it says, God says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. I mean, it's not a surprise that God thinks about things differently, that he looks at things in a very different way than we do. Yet time and time again, we find ourselves judging people or even situations simply by what we can see on the outside. And we don't dig. We don't go any deeper. We look and we make a decision about it, and we move on with that. In this story of David's anointing as king, we see how mankind tends to react. I mean, Samuel hasn't even spoken to Eliab. But immediately he believes that he's got to be the new king because of something about him. Now, it doesn't say much about him. It doesn't say much about Eliab other than he walks in the room. But we can assume that there was something in his appearance perhaps, or something maybe in his confidence, the way he walked, or maybe perhaps it was something that he said that isn't actually recorded in the scriptures. I mean, we don't know what it is, but something convinced Samuel that this was the guy. Commanding presence, spoken something, whatever the case, Samuel sees the man and determines that this has got to be the king. But God has other plans. God has another idea. He tells Samuel that he is not looking at the things that Samuel is looking at, and he's to keep going. So Samuel does. One after another. He has each brother brought in, one after, from the eldest all the way down. Each one comes in, he doesn't examine it. Nope, that's not the one. Nope, that's not the one. God's not pleased with any of them to be king. And so he keeps sitting there. Jesse keeps sending the stuff in until eventually they get to the place where they find out that Jesse has the youngest son. He hasn't even called him in. He's out tending the sheep. Because, of course, you're not going to want the young kid. I mean, he's nothing. He's just a little kid, right? And he says, no, the Lord's rejected. I need to see each and every one of them. And of course, he calls him, and David comes in. David comes in and says, I don't know if I've lost my place or not. David comes in, and God says to Samuel, rise and anoint him. God doesn't look for the outward appearance. He looks at the heart. Rise and anoint him. He's the one. You know, God digs deeper to know the truth. I think that's right. I'm getting sick of the electronics. I'm going to stop paying attention to it entirely, I think. God looks deeper. It's more than just a conversation. He digs in to know the heart. He digs in to see what's going on. Whether it's a person or a situation, there's a deeper view that we have to have. It's easy to make judgments based on the things that we see with our eyes, but we all know when we get into conversations about it, we all know that there's a whole lot more going on than what we see with our eyes. Is that right? I sure think there is. I mean, there's a whole lot more to me than what most people can see from the outside, and there's a whole lot more to the situations I encounter in this life than what I initially see with my eyes too. Now, I don't know if you notice it or not in the trailer for Deepwater Horizon, but it mentions that it's based on a true story. That's why I put that up there. It says based on the true story. It's something that actually happened. And the real tragedy of it all is that this disaster could have been avoided if they had just dug a little deeper to see the truth. And if you watch the movie, I mean, my heart just breaks knowing that if they had just dug a little bit deeper, if they had been a little bit more steadfast in trying to dig up the heart of the matter, then the tragedy wouldn't have happened. So many times throughout this story, decisions were made based on surface judgments, and the result is devastating. As followers of Jesus, we are, in all that we do, trying to be more like Jesus, or at least we should be. But the truth is, we don't always naturally see things the way Jesus does. Sometimes we need to be extra diligent to be intentional. We have to do it on purpose. We have to be intentional about looking with His eyes. And if we don't, we're going to miss an awful lot. I think that's why the Apostle Paul, or at least one of the reasons why Paul says that we take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. Because it's really easy to slip into autopilot. For all of us, no exceptions. We all do it. Slip into autopilot. We need to be intentional. Now, what happens with David? I found a great photo of him. This was taken around the time that he fought Goliath. Okay, a few people got, come on, that's funny. Right? Got to work with me here. See, what happens here with David shows that it's about the heart. It's about what's going on deeper inside. That's what matters. And keep in mind, I'm not just talking about looks. I mean, that's a factor, certainly for us. When we look at other people, sometimes we make judgments based on how they look. But I'm not just talking about that. I'm talking about other things like status and position and stuff like that too, because we do the same thing there as well, don't we? Remember, David was tending sheep when Samuel came. He's tending sheep. He's a shepherd. That means he was poor. He didn't have much. He was also probably limited in his education. And in all appearances, he's just kind of an average guy doing menial work. And from the outside, there's not much to mark him as special. David was also the youngest, as I mentioned earlier, the youngest in a culture where the eldest is of all the importance. There's a hierarchy in the Hebrew culture. And David was the youngest. The youngest was entitled to the least. He would have had no favor upon him. As the youngest, all advantage would have passed him by because the Hebrews favored their eldest. And yet God chooses him. If we are to have the eyes of God, we too need to learn not to look at people, their appearance, or their position, or their status, but rather dig deeper to see the heart. The Apostle Paul once wrote in his letter to the Roman church, he said, "Live in harmony with everyone. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position." That's in Romans 12. It's the first part of verse 16. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. You know, it's one of our culture's biggest problems that we tend to look at status and other outward appearances as the way to judge people. We see somebody who looks like they have money, and we treat them very, very differently than somebody that comes in and looks like they haven't had a shower in a month. You don't believe me? Hang out downtown for a while. There's a whole crowd of people that hang out right there in the park every single day. They're always there. They're pretty cool. They're a lot of fun to talk to. They're great conversationalists, and like everybody else, they're desperate to have conversations, so it's good for me. But if you go and you spend time with them, it's awesome, but watch how many people just walk by. Watch how many people won't make eye contact. Now, I'm not saying I'm not saying this as a way to judge those people. I'd say that it's a natural thing. We often don't even think about it, right? We just go through the motions. I'm not making eye contact. It's not like we say, "Oh, those people," and we don't look. There's just people, we just don't. We become so habitual about it. In Deepwater Horizon, there's this interesting scene where one of the big bosses, played by John Malkovich, goes to see Mark Wahlberg's character. And they've both been in a meeting a little earlier where the corporate bigwigs are kind of pushing things ahead to get some results. They're behind on their schedule, and they've seen no real solid progress as far as corporate headquarters is concerned. So they're pushing the envelope. They're pushing the guys to move forward. In fact, they've sent a safety team home without having done the proper tests. And they're pushing and pushing and pushing. And most people are just doing what they say because of their status and their position. They know better. I mean, the safety team knows better. The entire purpose of them is to make sure that people don't die. They know better. They know right and wrong. They know what they should do, but they listen because of the status. They listen because of the position that these guys hold. Anyway, in this scene, the two of them come together, and Mark's character, this fellow on the left in the red, his character, he's not one of those. He's one of the exceptions to the rule. He sees right through it because he's one of the ones that's been digging a little deeper. He knows things are off. Everything's broken. It's his responsibility to look after things like the fire alarms in the different rooms, smoke detectors, and different pieces of electronic equipment and stuff like that. And he knows, man, there's a lot of stuff that's just busted, and you guys aren't looking after it. You can say all you want, but I know that you don't care about the people, and you don't care about the rig. What you care about is your money. He knows. And he says this, he has this really, really cool line. He says it's like you're trying to land the plane while you're running out of fuel. You're trying to stretch everything because for you it's about money. For you, it's not about the people. You can talk about how important everyone is till you're blue in the face, but I see what you're demonstrating. I know what's true. When we don't take the time to know a person's heart or to dig deeper to the heart of a matter, we miss so much. We miss the good, we miss the bad, but what's most tragic at all is when we don't take the time to dig deeper into the people around us or the situations around us, we miss the truth. We miss the end of the story. We miss all the details. We miss the truth. In all that we are, we need to look deeper into all that we do in life. We need to create in us a new culture of digging deeper to know the heart for everyone in our lives and around us. I mean, if there's one thing we need to recognize now after going through the last year, year and a half at this point, is that one of the things that matters more than anything else in this life is relationship. And until we're digging deeper to know the heart of people, we are going to miss out on opportunities for relationship, opportunities that we were meant to have. You see, now more than ever, people need help. Now more than ever, people need help. The last 16 months have done a real number on just about everybody, and the need for healing is everywhere. People need someone to talk to. People need someone to listen to them, to let them talk, even just unload. People need to be heard. They need to be cared for. They need to know they're not alone. But here's the thing, most people don't just need the help. They also need an extra measure of grace. They need an extra measure of grace. People are wound so tight nowadays. Many feel like they're hanging at the very end of a very thin rope. So when you bump into somebody at the grocery store and they've got grumpy face on and their frown is so large it's dragging on the ground, or maybe they mumble something that you take as like a snide comment or whatever. Like, I don't know what's happening around you when you go out and about, but when you bump into somebody and you run into somebody when you're out doing the things that you do, and what you see is anger and stress and like that, it's probably because those are the things they're feeling, but that's not who they are. And if that's how we judge people, then we are never going to be able to help. We will never know the people if we stop every time somebody has a frown, if we stop every time somebody's grumpy, if we don't bother to ask how somebody's doing because of the expression that's on their face. Because I'm going to be completely transparent with you, half the days of the week I'm walking around with a big dragon on the floor frown. Right? It's so easy right now for people to find themselves in a place of frustration and anger. And if those are the things you're seeing, that might be what they're feeling, but it's not who they are. Not at all. Just in the last week, I've had conversations with people that look like that, people that act like that, and a few of them were just kind of in that place and weren't going to crack. They weren't going to come out of their bubble. They were happy to be frowning. Right? They were happy to be in the place they were. They didn't want anybody bothering. They don't want anybody fixing them like this, and they just mumbled and took off. That's fine. I mean, you're not going to be able to have a conversation with everybody. But I'll tell you, a few of those people, all I did was say hello. And the top popped off the bottle, and they just started to pour out. We must be willing to do more than just look with our eyes or even simply hear with our ears. We need to be willing to go deeper. Our eyes will only reveal the cover of the book, you understand? We have to dig deeper. We cannot see into a person's heart unless we take the time to know them. And sometimes simply taking a moment with somebody is enough to get deep, deep, deep. Sometimes it's not. But sometimes all you got to do is say hello and start a conversation. The question we need to be asking ourselves is, are we willing? Are you willing to try? You know, one of the many things that I notice about David when I read this story, and it's something that God could surely see as well, is that David was not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, he was a pretty messed up guy in a lot of ways. He messed up all the time. But the one thing he did have was he had a total surrender. He was completely sold out to God. So as we're talking about this, I think it's important for all of us to also remember, even of ourselves, that we don't need to be perfect, that it's okay to be a little broken, that it's okay to make mistakes, it's okay to stumble a little bit. Because let me tell you, if you've never heard about it before, David sinned. I mean, he lied, he manipulated people, he lusted, he was an adulterer. He's even guilty of murder. But the Lord still called David a man after God's own heart. I mean, it's so odd when you think of it that way. It's strange, isn't it? David did some pretty horrible things in his life, scattered over his many, many years. He did some awful things, and yet God seems to favor him so very much. Now, because I've just said that, before I go any further, I do want to clarify something. I am not suggesting that it's okay to sin. I'm not saying that at all. I am not suggesting that any of David's sinful behaviors were somehow justified just because he loved God so much. It doesn't work like that. It's not a balancing act. It's not about doing more good things than bad things. That's not what it's about. Don't fall into the trap of this kind of thinking. It's never okay to sin. That's not what I'm saying. It's never okay to turn our hearts away from God. In fact, I would suggest to you that when David was doing these things, that it hurt God's heart very, very much to see his child David doing those things, choosing sin. But what this situation does illustrate to us is that God is bigger than your sin. God is bigger than the mistakes that we make. God is bigger than the trip that might happen, the fall. God is bigger than the things we're going to encounter, and He's bigger than the things we're going to do, too. Remember that thing I've said so many times now? There is nothing you can do to make God love you anymore. There's also nothing you can do to make Him love you any less. His love for you will never change. He's got an infinite pool of grace in His heart because His heart is perfect. God is bigger than your sin. He has a capacity for mercy and a capacity for grace that goes beyond the limits of our humanness and even beyond the limits of our sin. But the answer is always in Him. It's not a matter to be taken lightly. The point here is that it is not okay to sin, but rather it is okay to be not perfect. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to fall short, to stumble, because it's not our strengths or skills that we find perfection in. It's not our talents or gifts that we find perfection in. It is not in any of our abilities, our attitudes, or our character traits that we find perfection in. It is only in Jesus Christ that any of us is made perfect. Any of us. And if we want to have the eyes of God, then we cannot keep doing it our way. There's no power in our way. The power is in Him, being where He is, doing what He's doing. We must start doing it His way, if we aren't already. We can no longer look at people's shortcomings and judge the person that we see with our eyes. We can't make the mistake of judging people by their status or their position either, and we must be prepared to look beyond what a person seems capable of and remember that with God, all things are possible. That's Matthew 19:26. This is very much a new season, not just for us, for everyone. This is a new season right now, and we cannot take anything for granted. Everyone has been affected by the isolation that we've endured. Everyone is in a different place, and it's up to us to put our best foot forward to draw on His strength and give just a little bit more to as many as we're able. The church is not a museum for good people. It is a field hospital for the broken. It is a place where people find healing, and that means you and me too. So remember, grace starts here. When you look around this room, the brothers and sisters that you see, remember all those people, the grumpy face, the whatever, the stuff I was talking about earlier. That may be somebody here too. Just because we know Jesus doesn't mean we don't have a bad day. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Jesus promised that in this life you will have trouble. Now, before I close, there's just one more thing I want to say about the movie, because I'm supposed to be tying that in somehow, right? There is one thing more that I want to say. I wonder what all the fathers are going to be doing this afternoon. Anyway, so I just throw that out there. It's a great movie. Of course, it's a beautiful day, too, so maybe everybody be outside. But before I close, there's just one thing I want to say about Deepwater Horizon, and that is the number Rachel, could you switch it to the next slide for me, please? Next one. That one. There we go. Picture from the movie. What impacted me tremendously is in the midst of absolute chaos, when everything going on around is horrific, the number of people in incredible pain and physical brokenness stepping up to help others. Mark Wahlberg's character gets smashed by a steel door that has to weigh 300 or 400 pounds. Slammed against the wall, shattered glass, he's cut, he's bruised, he may have some broken something somewhere. He is in awful, awful shape, and the first thing he does is start picking guys up and hauling them out. 3, 4, 5, he's just grabbing it, goes looking for the boss. Kurt Russell's character goes and carries the guy out. He constantly, in his own state of hurt, he's giving to others. I invite you this week to do just that. Look for opportunities to reach out to someone this week. Whatever way you feel comfortable. I have to clarify that. We are still in COVID season, right? But you can still reach out. Maybe it's just a phone call. Maybe it's a conversation on a bench. But when you do, be intentional about looking beyond the cover and dig a little deeper to see the heart. Pray beforehand for that opportunity. And when those people come in to your life, just say, hi, my name's Aaron. What's yours? Well, don't say my name's Aaron because I'm Aaron. You're not. But you know what I mean. Just say, hi, my name is so-and-so. How you doing? You may be, Rachel, put the last slide up for me, please. You may be the only Jesus that person meets. Do you understand what I mean when I say that? You might be the only representation of Jesus that they ever get to see. We all have the capacity to give something. And that's what this week's about. Just to reach out your hand or your voice or whatever it may be to offer someone in our community or maybe further out a little bit of hope, a little bit of help, a little bit of love.